And Jim is short for James, so that's why they call him Uncle Jim.
I do want to ask, you had an interesting experience about the Confederate statue down over there at that corner. You want to say
which interesting experience?
Oh,
ironic, isn't it, that the African Americans though do end up right next to the Confederates?
Well, the Confederates aren't. We really don't know where the Confederate soldiers are. I've heard different theories that they're out there in public. There's even a theory that they're in the unmarked. There's some unmarked graves in the middle of the Civil War section. If you coincide the way they dug the trenches, you could make the case that they're there, but without DNA evidence, we'll never know.
I mean,
but the marker was placed there in 1904, and you have to remember, this was the back part of the cemetery in 1904. You talked about the flooding. There used to be some tributaries that tied back that way to Pigeon Creek that would flow on the back edge of the ground. And even though when you're in certain sections of the cemetery, I could be in the middle of August in a drought, and back there by the urban forestry department, I can dig 4 foot down for a grave, and I'm gonna hit groundwater, even if it's droughted, because those tributaries are still here. They're just, you can't see them. They're below the ground. Not as bad as, I mean, it wouldn't have been as bad here, but you know, as the cemetery expanded, you know, with that addition and the western addition, which we'll get into with the second tour. But I have a theory myself. If you look at the GAR marker, which is over there, the soldier's like he's got his head down, and he's like he's guarding something. I would theorize that I would put my money the Confederates are over there in that, around that tree area, with that guy kind of standing guard over him. But I have seen compelling evidence that makes the case that they could actually be in the Civil War section. But all their names are there. The issue was, though, with the markers, that's a memorial marker. There's over 70,000 interments here. It's not my job as superintendent to judge what somebody did in life, but if somebody wants to leave memorialization, I'm going to defend that right to the bitter end. And you know, recently there was some media controversy trying to stir up likes and stuff, and they tried to compare this marker here, which is only one of 2 in Indiana, to what was going on down south, and it's not apples to apples. And is that the story you're wanting to tell?
No, I was thinking something having to do with the Stars and Bars. Somebody, as there was an African American procession there.
Okay, that story. There's a Sons of the Confederacy group that's active in Western Kentucky, and they'll come out here sometimes and they'll put flags at that marker. And the first couple years I was superintendent, they were putting the battle flag right there. Well, the African American section is right through here, up that way. And when you're leading an African American section or service back there, and you didn't do your homework and check the Stars and Bars are sitting there flying, it kind of, it's not a good look for the city. And we always pulled the flag. Well, they were upset, saying that, oh, you're ruining our heritage. So I try to always compromise. I'm like, look, the true flag of the Confederacy is not that. 95% of the people in the country don't know that there were 3 flags of the Confederacy. Take the one that's more circular, that nobody really knows, and if you're going to put a flag out for Memorial Day, put that one there, and I'm not going to pull it. Because 95% of the folks that are going by have no idea what that is. So,
well, I just want to say on that, it's important to know that these men who have fought in the United States Colored Troops, they were amongst 179,000 African American men who fought in the Army. They had almost an 80% death rate not because of the fighting, because a lot of them were relegated to cooks, grave diggers, believe it or not, camp aides. They died because of disease and starvation. So these men who enlisted, who had a heart like Mr. Ambrose, enlisted to want to fight to defend their families, fellow African Americans, but they were a lot of them were prevented from that, except for several battalions who fought. You guys know them, you know the story Glory. There were only certain battalions that actually got a chance to fight. Most of the men, they worked to try to aid the Union as much as they can. But people like Mr. Ambrose actually got a chance to fight. And of that 179,000, that didn't include the almost 9,000 that was part of the Navy. And they had an even higher mortality rate. So there were people who were living and dying to defend and try to get freedom for their fellow African Americans. And so we can't forget them.
Do they know where he lived at here in Evansville?
Governor.
Governor.
If you go to the Evansville African American Museum, it's on Garvin, and the street that's over behind it is Governor. So he lived on Governor Street.
But what I'm back to my point, it's a fine balance because there's 70,000 different stories and everybody has the right to memorialization, and you have to respect this, you have to respect that, and I get stuck in the middle of these historical debates sometimes that go back it's you know, you have to try to find a balance to make everybody happy and not offend, but also preserve the memories of Mr. Ambrose, the memories of the troops that died in the hospital. You know, there's murders, there's rapists, there's all sorts of bad that goes on. It's not my point to judge what they did.
Well, and what's happening down in New Orleans is not in the cemetery.
No.
They're taking down the memorials that were
But
put up
if you
in
look
other
at
places.
the camp in Indy at Garfield Park, 2 days after they tried to do the story here, I told them they're only going to endanger these markers, and sure enough, a man took a sledgehammer after the Indianapolis Star, you know, which I'm not getting in the middle of political debates, but they try to sensationalize stories like that and try to redraw history, and it just, whether it's this marker, that marker, I was making sure that didn't happen here.
Right.
And that was, I'll tell that story. I don't want to take away from this story.
No.
Yeah.
We are going to I'm seeing Mr. Tiddington down there. So we're going to go over and visit S.S. Dupree. Evansville's early doctors. He actually had his office in the Baptist Town area near the Governor Street area. And he has a really interesting story. Again, he was born during this time period of slavery, and he actually went to Terre Haute. He was born a slave, and he went to Terre Haute, to the normal school in Terre Haute. And he got his education there, like most of the former slaves that managed to come to Evansville, because at the time, you have to remember, Indiana regulated how many African Americans could actually immigrate into Indiana from places like Kentucky, Tennessee. According to our Constitution, the 1851 Constitution, there could only be so many, and they had to have a certain status in order to come into the Indiana area. So those who migrated from Kentucky into Indiana usually came because they had some type of skill. So it can be safely assumed that his family, and when he came, they had some type of marketable skill that would have been useful for the community. And so when he came over, because he was denied an education as a slave, he went to Terre Haute, which had a normal school that eventually became Indiana College. So a lot of the people that we're talking about today actually got their education at the normal school, and he actually went from the normal school in Terre Haute up to Indy and went to medical school. Once he got his medical degree, he started working in St. Louis, and he also worked in Nashville. But he came to Evansville because there was a real need of doctors. This was a time before Buckner. You guys have heard of Buckner Tower? He was a predecessor of Dr. Buckner. Dr. Buckner was able to get his office because of Dr. Dupree. He led an interesting life because he fought for African American health care here in Evansville, and he also was one of the people working on the precursor to what was known as the well-born clinic. And so he was part of a group of people that also included Dr. Thompson, who I wish I could show you his grave, but he's in the section, I believe 44, that's not very close. And so, but to talk about the African American doctors, there was no clinic before Dr. Dupuy and Dr. Thompson got together and had an idea of creating the clinic that eventually became the Wellborn Annex. You would have to literally make a house call to a doctor who was in the area to come to your house for treatment. So you had African American coal miners, African American dock workers, and laborers who could not get health treatment. They couldn't go to a white doctor. And there was usually only 1 to 2 African American doctors working in Baptisttown at a time. So you can imagine they were very busy. You also have to remember, these were people who not necessarily could always pay in cash. There's a story, we had a record at the Evansville African American Museum that Dr. Dupuy and Dr. Thompson, as well as later Dr. Buckner, would actually take dry goods for payments because they knew that their clients couldn't always pay in cash. And so they were really wanting to make sure that the African American community here had good treatment. They also worked on fraternal organizations to organize African Americans politically here in Evansville. All of the men actually that I'm talking about today were part of a group known as the Knights of Pythias. It was a fraternal organization that wanted to intellectually uplift the African American community. A lot of them were also members of the Masonics, the Masons, as well as they created their own African American clubs and organizations. One of which was based on, I lost my place. They wanted to make sure that African Americans received a proper burial. So they worked with early funeral homes like Gaines, which actually Gaines Funeral Home started in about 1880 and they closed, I believe, in the 1960s, either 1950s or the 1960s. And actually there's a little bit of continuing into the 70s actually for some of the Gaines employees. And so Gaines Funeral Home would actually work with these fraternal organizations in order to allow the people in the community to put money aside for proper and decent burials. And a lot of these fraternal organizations will have membership functions that will help African Americans be buried. So it was very important that they not only intellectually fostered the community, they formed organizations that would help build things like the Cherry Street YMCA, which was the African American version of the YMCA. Because again, segregation, you couldn't go to the white YMCA, so you had to have your own. Same with the library, because you couldn't allow books to go across race. And so they helped organize the Cherry Street Library. So these were the men who were working politically in order to help the African American community. And S.S. Dupree was one of those men. Now, we're gonna walk down a little further.
Can I clarify one thing?
Sure.
This is the row marker.
Uh-huh.
If he would have had a headstone, it would be right here and the grave would be right here, just to clarify.
Yeah. We figured that he would have, something had happened to his marker at some point.
Yeah.
We can only, because his wife is right here.
Yeah. So I mean, the headstone would be right here and the grave would be right there.
Yeah.
Just to, because I saw you, Dr. Brown, filming. I didn't want you thinking that was the headstone.
There were the requirements for African Americans to cross into Indiana. Did Dr. Dupuy have anything before he went to the normal school? Like, did he have a trade or a special skill or something that allowed him to cross?
No. So it most likely was his father who they brought
and
into
then who
with
they
the
let
family.
him cross, and then he brought the family.
$500 loan.
Yeah.
Oh,
To move
interesting.
here after 1851.
It's very interesting commentary given current discussions that are going about other borders.
Well,
So,
I have I don't want to spoil it yet. We're gonna see another Mr. Thompson a little later who will further kind of clarify that. So hang that thought for me.
well, just amazing because there's
can come up with that kind of money.
Money.
yeah,
in 1851.
someone who puts himself through school and does such great things.
Yeah.
Amazing.
And Mr.
Wonderful.
Thompson's story is gonna really show that. So hang on for me.
All right,
Hang on for
hanging.
me. Again, he was born a slave. Excuse me. Take that back. He was born Reconstruction. He was the principal of the Governor Street School. He also got his education at the normal school, which was in Terre Haute. He came here after going to the normal school, and he began teaching at Clark Street School, which was the first African American school here in town. Actually the second. The first was really a one-room schoolhouse that was located near Clark Street, but the first organized school was the Clark Street School. And so he began teaching there. He would also teach in Washington, Indiana, as well as in the county area of Evansville. But he then became principal of Governor High School, which was the high school after Clark Street School. Now, he did not get along with that gentleman there with the big headstone, who is Ernest Tidrington. As a matter of fact, Ernest Tidrington was a very, very powerful man. And he spread a rumor that Mr. Best was sleeping with his students. There was nothing founded on this. And so you can imagine it's a small town, and we might think perhaps that the beef continues in life. But he is very important in the education of the Evansville African American community, because even to this day, up until the 1970s, there was Clark Street School, there was Governor Street School, then there was Lincoln High School. And from Lincoln High School until the desegregation of the schools in the 1960s and 70s, you would have went to one of those three schools. And so education was a way that African Americans could gain wealth, could gain political holds, could contain, to attain life, a good life that they wanted. And a lot of that was through becoming a teacher or a principal. And so education was highly held in the African American community. And so he did a lot of work for the community here as far as education goes. Now we're gonna move to him, our friend here, which is Mr. Rouse, or Reverend Rouse. He was the second Reverend of Liberty Baptist Church, which is the oldest African American church in Evansville. It's located downtown across from St. Mary's parking lot. Now, Liberty Baptist Church was formed by former slaves. Reverend Rouse was born as a slave in Henderson, Kentucky. Well, many people don't know. And if I could ask you to do me a favor, and I sit on the headstone.
Okay, right.
This is a sacred space.
Okay, yes.
Thank you.
Sorry.
It's all right. Because we're visiting with our friends. We're walking with our ancestors. And there's a little bit of small ceremony that we'll do at the last site we're going to go. But Reverend Rouse, he was born a slave. And what not many people know is that Henderson, Kentucky was a slave market. So when you talk about liberty and freedom, when you cross that bridge from Henderson over into Evansville, that's all that separated from slavery and freedom. So you had many people who crossed that boundary, who crossed that Ohio River to gain their freedom on the Underground Railroad. Now, he didn't travel on the Underground Railroad, but he came over, like many African Americans fleeing the South, wanting to make sure they made it to free territory, just in case things got rescinded from the Civil War. So he came over and he helped start up Liberty Baptist Church, which started in, their physical building started in 1860, and the first church was completed, the formation of the congregation, I should say, started in 1867 and would be solidified by 1868. And they finished building their church in 1886. Now, right after they finished building the church, Mother Nature decided to send a cyclone and knock the church completely down. However, by 1887, the congregation managed to raise $7,000 and were able to rebuild the church. But that church was founded by former slaves because religion was important. It was the only thing that helped African Americans, that hope, that faith, that they would be out of bondage one day, that faith in God that got them through, got us through, got my people through. And so Reverend Rouse was one of the leaders in the community. Again, you had teachers, you had doctors, philanthropists, and preachers who helped push the Baptist town community. Now, you also had someone else pushing the Baptist town community, and he's right here. Pushing forward, I guess I should say. You have Mr. Ernest Tidrington. This is his plot. He wanted to make sure that people knew that he had wealth and power. So he imitated a lot of the wealthy white burials here in Oak Hill. So Ernest was known as the boss of Baptist town. He was, for in better words, a mob boss here in town. He could control anywhere between 2,000 to 3,000 votes at will. Now this is important because a lot of the candidates who for mayor, for sheriff, needed the African American vote. This was during a time in the 1870s during the Reconstruction. The African Americans held power for the very first time post-slavery. They were actually able to make an impact on not just the black community, but the white community. So, Baptist Town was known for a little bit as the Bloody Seven. It was known that because almost every election day, there would be a fight over which candidate would get the vote. Well, not wanting to disrupt the community anymore, Mr. Tidrington had the idea, we will get together and we will sell our vote to the candidate that pays us the most. This brought money into the African American community, and it also brought some safety to the community because the candidate that they would vote for would basically have a piece that they couldn't attack the black community. This is at a time, the start of the Klan, the heavy start and power of the Klan, and the Knights of the White Camellia, who would come into Baptist Town and harass the shopkeepers as well as families in the neighborhood. So they kind of, Tidrington would say, okay, we'll vote for the Klan candidate, but you can't come into our community and attack us. So it was a way of protecting the community. It was a way of making sure the community got money to sustain itself. Now, Mr. Tidrington was born in Clarksville, Tennessee. He actually went to the normal school. He then went to Washington, D.C. and was a clerk for the law library for Congress. He then decided he was going to come back to Evansville, and he was a janitor for a little bit. And from being a janitor, he then became an undersheriff, and then eventually a detective under the Bossy regime. And then from that, he became boss of Baptist Town. So he was a mover and he was a shaker, moving and shaking all the place. Now, there was one fateful day. There was a gentleman by the name of Luther Bell. He decided that he saw something differently, that we should not be selling, the African American community should not be selling the votes to the Klan, and he had an ought with Mr. Tidrington. And so he picked up a 12-gauge shotgun, went to the pool hall that Mr. Tidrington, his wife was actually still in the car in the parking lot, but Mr. Tidrington was in the pool hall. He pulled a 12-gauge shotgun, and he ended up getting Mr. Tidrington in the head. And so Mr. Tidrington died, and he was buried, and he was the last boss of Baptist Town. Now, again, irony of a small town, Luther Bell is not too far away in that direction.
Where was Baptist Town at?
Baptist Town is the area in which the Evansville African American Museum is. So it went north until you got to the Lloyd, and went as far south as Sweetson.
Okay, wow.
It went toward downtown until you got to Liberty Baptist Church, and then it went as far east as to right before you get to UV.
Wow.
So huge area.
Dang.
At one time there were about 20 to 30,000 people living in that area of the community, just African American. And they also had a Jewish population there because stigmatizing the Jewish community too. They couldn't live anywhere else and so had stores in Baptist Town that were run by Jewish families.
So no normal white people could move in. Could they move into that area if they wanted to, or
they were lower class? They couldn't.
Really lower class. Okay.
Baptist Town actually had a large mixed race population. Really? It's also where the speakeasies were. So people would come into white people would come into Baptist Town and they would party and have families, but not necessarily always live. Wow. So it wasn't the place where upstanding white individuals wanted to live.
Wow.
From the white perspective.
Yeah.
From the black perspective, this was a thriving community of people who were educators, who were doctors, who were lawyers, and were political movers and shakers. So we're going to get back in our cars and we're going to go to our last stop, which is visiting Jacob C. Thompson. Okay. 2016, when I was contacted by the FOP in order to do research about the life of Jacob C. Thompson. He's important because he was born a slave, like so many we have talked about today. And he was born a slave in Eastern Kentucky, and his father came over as part of that constitutional agreement. He was a carpenter, and his father worked on several houses that are downtown along the waterfront. His father was a highly skilled carpenter. He was 15 years old in 1867 when his father came over, again from Kentucky, in order to work and be a carpenter on the houses downtown. This was the time when the Klan began to terrorize the people who were living in what is known as Baptist Town. He saw this and he wanted to make a change. He wanted to do something to protect his community. The first thing he did was get an education at the normal school up in Terre Haute. He then became a teacher and kind of sort of like Mr. Best, started to work in the counties. He would work at Clark Street School where he actually got his first education. So imagine being a slave who didn't know how to read, going to school, getting an education, and then going back into the school where you first learned how to read and teaching those students. He saw that education, although it was needed in the community, was not really helping the community because it needed to be protected. He applied to the police force and was accepted into the police force in 1877. He worked the beat of Baptist Town, arrested several individuals, helped protect a store that was being bombarded in Baptist Town by the Klan. And then December of 1877, he started to get sick. He got sicker and sicker. Eventually the police force told him, you're gonna have to stay home. He had consumption and it worked very, very quickly. And then in January of 1878, he died. Very young, as you can tell. But from the age of 15 until he died, I believe, 23, he worked to try to help the Baptist Town community. And so he was one of the